Okay, I think everybody is more or less back in. Okay, our next guest is Patricia Reed. Patricia Reed was born in Ottawa, Canada, and completed her studies in the studio arts at Concordia University in Montreal. Her work has been exhibited recently at Homeworks 7, Hope After Hope in Beirut, in the Witte de Wit Gallery in Rotterdam, Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin, and in many other places. But she's also a writer, and she contributed to publications such as Crossbenching Towards Participation as Critical Spatial Practice, edited by Marcus Miesen, hashtag Accelerate, the acceleration is the reader, edited by Robin McKay and Armin Avenisian, and Xenofeminism, A Politics for Alienation by the collective Laboria Cubonics, of which she's also a member. Please welcome Patricia Reed.
So thanks a lot for the invitation. Merci beaucoup pour ça. And actually really appreciated your last question because I don't think I have the answer to it, but I'm at least going to unpack it a little bit more. So the title of this talk is Politics and Complexity Mediation. So as the preface for this two-day series of talks and discussions takes up, substantial alternatives to our current political condition seem at a standstill, despite the proliferating crises in various domains and sectors. So this failure of alternatives has been repeatedly diagnosed throughout the cultural and theoretical discursive spheres, to the degree that we seem stuck in what I would like to call a tragic safety net. So tragic since it always fails, and yet a safety net of sorts, since although we may structurally fail at instigating alternatives, we seem to imagine ourselves standing or clicking back at a distance, pointing to the horrid spectacle before us, basking in the glow of our potential knowing better. So such a safe viewing distance is not only impossible, but operates, I would argue, in a mode of resignation. We are all in the middle, whether we willfully subscribe to the condition of the world or not. No one is left unaffected by our current neoliberal order, even if it's in decline, as the last speculations would have it. Whether you're a city banker who directly profits, or an islander from the Maldives who suffers climactic consequences. So the big collective question we need to be asking is, how do we escape this tragic cycle of perhaps knowing better, but effecting little? So just before diving in, I'd like to make a few quick points on accelerationism, at which point I'll just simply retire the term for good. Since we're in the presence of the Benjamin Noyes, who actually launched the term in a pejorative sense, the two writers of the manifesto who took it up in the affirmative, I'm somewhere in between. So although the term seemed to be a successful branding tactic, generating polemical discussion in the last years, evidenced the fact by, well, we're here, I don't find the term particularly helpful for a few reasons, if I even support many of the claims or ambitions articulated under the label. So firstly, the obvious question of power that it leaves unaddressed, the term, I'm not saying Nick and Alex, but the term in itself, namely who or what does the accelerating? So it makes the term vulnerable to all sorts of expropriations. So as we have seen with the right or neo-reactionary use of the word. Neo-reactionary any sort of qualitative horizon without a lot of background of qualitative horizon. Second, the way accelerationism is mistaken for brute speed, leaving many to assume accelerationists are simply techno-fetishists wanting to urge on capitalist forces towards their self-destruction for the birth of a new world order. Now, of course, some on the right side of the spectrum, a figure like Nick Land, do push in that dystopian direction, but the ones on the left have a more functionist, slow, and quite radically pragmatic take on things, wanting to assess and sift through some of the logistics and byproducts of the capitalist system to seek strategies for their possible transformation for post-capitalist prospects. So if the term is ambiguous enough to house all these polar positions, it is far too indeterminate for my taste in terms of semantically declaring the quality of futurity one is trying to create. Now that said, what to my mind it is crucial to hold onto with this term is the fact that acceleration is, by definition, the measure of the rate of change. So although we may feel as if our lives are moving nauseatingly fast, they do so fully anchored in place like an amusement park ride tethered to the centrifugal imperatives of late capitalism. So in sentimental diagram, we really aren't moving, even if we're swirling about. So seeing as the actual temporality of left accelerationism, as Nick and Alex were addressing in their initial presentation, it's actually very slow due to its counter-hegemonic scalar ambitions. I'd propose the much less brand-savvy moniker of reorientate, with the imperative that it must be a verb, so a doing, and it must have a re, to do away with the narratives of degree zero revolutionary drives. So of course, no doubt we'd not be here today if my modest and rather boring suggestion had been taken up. But in identifying the general thrust of reorientation behind the manifesto, it opened another vector of thought which focuses on navigation and the question of our very cognitive access to a world that is increasingly complex and entangled. So it's precisely along that vector, which your question alluded to earlier. So it's around that vector that I'll speak to today. So namely the ways in which we come to know or navigate the world. The way that transforms our self-understanding or self-image. And lastly, what sort of political affordances open up because of these cognitive transformations. So in dropping the term acceleration, it's not to do away with a set of principles and diagnoses I would generally endorse, but it is to do away with a brand that lends itself to facile caricaturization, that has created some unhelpful polarization within leftist political spheres, dividing, to my mind, capacities and creating some false enemies when there's actually much common ground through which to collectively work. Where am I here? So the simple question at the heart of my talk, simple question, very impossible answer, is how can emancipatory political forms be thought that are fit for an age of planetary complexity? And I'll warn you that there's probably a lot more questions in this talk than answers, but that's just how it's going to have to be at this point. So can and how are we to intervene in and alter our probable political course when we can readily see a non-future of debt enslavement, climate catastrophe, and increasing social inequality on our immediate horizon, if it's not already knocking at our door? Our communications technologies and the paradoxical network centralization we experience, bound to the fate of the rather now popular narrative that we've slipped into a sort of techno-neo-feudalism, is the only way out of these globally intricate problems to strip back, simplify, and render our interrelations with each other and with the world readily tractable in order to reclaim some sort of stable cognitive picture of our world, our bodies, and our diverse positions within it. Now, both narratives, I'd like to point out, seem only able to repeat the patterns of benefiting the few. So where unproductive wealth creation gets increasingly concentrated in the hands of an ever-shrinking investor or inheritor class, and where scaling back actually reinforces, perhaps inadvertently so, a type of exclusionary or parochial politics that can only include immediate neighbors, subtended by phenomenological, familiar, or sensible biases. So where does all of that leave us with regard to the concerns and justice for the many? With neither narrative living up to any sort of desirable or scalable emancipatory promise, how are we to recalibrate our political imaginations? So although historically speaking, we've seen much violence enacted in the name of macro hegemonic modern projects, articulated through mechanisms of colonialization and the installing of the profit or property incentives across the globe, It should be equally pointed out that to refuse or demonize scalar thinking absolutely also reproduces emotive violence, insofar as it abnegates political responsibility for abstract, unseen, and distant interactions that ripple outwards and feed back into planetary organizational schemata, buttressing climactic, social, and economic injustices. Now, we must, of course, learn from our histories, especially the unjust ones, but also insist on the non-conflation of history with ontology. Without such an assistance, we will be stuck in fatalisms. So we know how complex and interdependent our world is, and probably to some degree always was. Why then does the word complexity serve less as a useful, processual, or qualitative description of systemic interaction, and more as a term used to instill ambiguity, or worse, to stifle political access? Our geopolitical structures of governance do not come close to accommodate these real complexities, where the disciplinary entanglement of our most pressing issues, say the way in which an already complex issue of the climate cannot be adequately addressed without interfacing it with the equally complex domain of economy, for example. To put it another way, the plastic and generatively artificial ways currently afforded to us in organizing cohabitation are incommensurate with reality. They don't measure up. So how can we begin to start conceiving a necessary symmetry? It seems that we're caught in an immobile state of complexity impotence, unable to properly frame, gain orientation, and mobilize in response to our reality, leading to an asystemic simplification that too easily conflates the evil actions of, say, a CEO with the sorts of economic injustices built into a globally sanctioned institutional megastructures. This is what you were alluding to with the conspiracy theory mentioning. So here we evoke quick, easy moralisms rather than thinking new models of value, use, and distribution. Or as we see, as Nick was pointing out, with the proliferation of conspiracy theories, where there's an easily indexable dubious character or organization operating as the world's master puppeteer. So here we simplify and consolidate an assemblage of numerous nested interacting actors and systems to a single figurehead. Now, it's because of these diagnoses that complexity itself must become politicized, no longer used to brush away difficult interconnected problems, but harnessed as an integral category for cognitive and libidinal investment if any sort of scalable emancipatory project is to gain traction beyond mere wishful thinking, purist moralism, or symbolic constraints. So what are we exactly indicating with the term complexity? Since there's no straightforward definition of complexity besides a general description of systemic nesting, it's what you could call a relative concept, since it's dependent on the status of our existing models, which are of course never fixed. Having been born in the 70s across a variety of fields like cybernetics, economics, philosophy, artificial intelligence, amongst others, complexity spans a variety of knowledge domains and has a high degree of application, particularly today in climate modeling, economic forecasting, biology, and computer sciences in our current moment. So a complex system is best understood as a structure with variation that is arranged into a whole via an exchange of information. So important here is that information can also mean material and energy forms as well. Complex systems are not static, they're not overly determined or determinate structures with mechanical inputs and outputs, yielding strictly predictable outcomes. In seeking maximum applicability for the fields of climate change activism, and its already mentioned entanglement with economics, the interdisciplinary philosopher Jennifer Wells provides us with a very lean description of complexity as, quote, dynamic interactions of multiple elements engaged in self-organizing processes, end quote. And she's insistent in pointing out the far-reaching implications of complexity upon epistemology, ontology, ethics, and to which I would add socio-environmental possibility as well. What's important to point out with complexity is that because it seeks to synthesize the mathematical, the physical, the biological, and the social, we can no longer find adequate access to the systemic realities foregrounded by complexity within strictly classical epistemic categories. To put that in a more simple way, complexity necessitates a transdisciplinary perspective, to which we'll return in a little bit. So when we consider our current geopolitical structures as a type of graphical user interface for accessing and intervening in the world, our current geopolitical, what you call Westphalian GUIs, seem ill-equipped to cope with the realities of our time that operate in intra, extra, and non-territorial ways simultaneously. To begin to tackle this incommensurability, at least conceptually, it seems ever more pressing to gain cognitive traction on complex structures and causation, and B, leverage and guide this cognitive traction towards planetary-scaled emancipatory affordances. So the first question, if we kind of diagnose that, the first question that we need to be asking is what sort of epistemic or knowledge-based framework would be required to generate the type of intelligence capable of cognitively accessing complex objects, precisely the objects that require urgent alter-politicization. What sorts of complications do these objects pose to our classical modern epistemic frames that emphasize discrete territories of investigation, we can call disciplines, yielding useful knowledge, but at the price of doing so from a limited scale or perspective? Secondly, how are we to design epistemic structures that can access future objects we cannot yet conceive or may not as yet exist? And thirdly, how will we integrate other spectrums of intelligence alien to human cognition, be it via artificial general intelligence or other life forms in a non-trivial way, delivering perhaps a final Copernican blow to the presumed anthropocentric monopoly on intelligence? If the political theoretical incitement for post-Westphalian diagrams seek to reconfigure geopolitical logic, so too, I would argue, epistemic frameworks must undergo their own post-Westphalian moment, where strictly bounded, sovereign, classical epistemic frontiers no longer serve the scope of thinking complexity required. So to be clear, this is not to suggest the total negation of territories or disciplines of knowledge, but it is to insist on their functional synthesis amongst other various types, perspectives, and sources, both human and non-human. Such a task appears even more difficult in our current landscape, where facts, it seems, can be felt. And facts, it seems, at one's subjective discretion is precisely why we need to work on a robust interfacing of epistemology and politics. Through the sociological analysis of scientific practice, so the social studies of science, that broadly looks at the social forces driving knowledge production, looks at the social of epistemology and politics. When powerful actors, and indeed states themselves, can completely disregard scientific consensus, even if, of course, it's always incomplete and always fallible, under a perverted misuse of knowledge as construction, we can see how knowledge has become somewhat impotent in influencing power as a force for substantial change. We see this evidence when research can be cherry-picked or ignored at whim because it's always bound to biased interests, so that's in inverted sarcastic quotes. so long as it reinforces existing modes of power distribution, existing modes, efficacy of austerity measures that seem to affect little policy change come to mind here as day-to-day examples of this troubling gap between knowledge and political integration. Equally disturbing is that within fields of knowledge production themselves, we see a far too quick reaction caricaturizing other disciplines as either being a totally naive expression of opinions and a collection of shared ideological platitudes. So this is like a caricature of when the hard sciences gaze down on the humanities. And we saw this with a very famous case, the Sokol affair in the 1980s, where he published a paper in a deconstructivist journal called The Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity. It was a total hoax. Not to mention the radical defunding of the humanities in favor of STEM. Or, from my own side here, or when the humanities blinded by the lens of classical epistemic categories that will to explain the world through dissection alone and the neat compartmentalization of knowledge. What this synthetic imperative ultimately entails is no longer the pitting of the hard against the soft, the ideal against the real, the concrete against the abstract, but focuses on the transitions between the two as co-constitutive of our reality and our place in it. So these concepts can be readily mapped into Wilfrid Sellars, the analytic philosopher, philosophical project curiously written about a decade or so before the actual rise of complexity studies. Sellars was a thinker of scale and of how all things, as he said, hang together, even though they're radically different. So as a thinker of continuums, he asked how we could gain navigational traction in knowing one's way around in a world where, quote, cabbages and kings, possibilities and finger snaps, numbers and duties, end quote, coexist in the same continuous world. He contrasted knowing one's way around as knowing how to ride a bike compared to knowing that, wherein knowing that is when I sit here and tell you that enacting steady pressure on pedals of a wheeled device will propel one forward. Now, the former mode, or knowing how, is not something that we sort of consciously think about once we have the hang of it. Yet Sellars insists that much of our human activities presuppose an integration of the two realms of knowing. And by extension, because of that, they have the capacity to mutually contaminate one another in very transformative ways. So the decisive undertaking in being able to know one's way around lies in constructing what he calls a stereoscopy between the manifest image, so the way humans imagine themselves in the world, and the agency built into that first-person perspective, the agency built the agency perspective to describe the world. And to look at how these two forms of world-making move in and out of each other. So we can here think of the Copernican revolution as a sort of quintessential example, insofar as the abstract scientific knowledge altered the anthropomorphic, self-referential bias of our former manifest image, of course, of us being the center of the universe. And our self-image here was radically alienated by this abstract knowledge that most of us will never have first-person access to. So additionally, it ought to be mentioned, Sellars extends his visual metaphor, warning us against the disciplinary visual metaphor. insisted that complexity and transdisciplinarity kind of go together, but is to highlight the limitations brought on through analytical dissection alone, or exclusive focus on the one, on particularity, or on perspectival difference. So the synthetic demand inherent to any project seeking to politicize complexity, to emphasize this point, is not about privileging the large over the small, the global over the local, the universal over the particular, continuity over difference, the abstract over the concrete. It is about grasping the interfacing of those scales and modes of existence, how they transition, which is not as simple as So the particular, or put more geometrically, the point, never exists in isolation. It doesn't exist in a vacuum space where it can simply be dissected to generate a proper picture of what that object in question is. To put it in a more straightforward terms, perhaps arguably biased because of my late 90s art education, biased the quintessential vehicle to articulate the intertwinement of art with politics. So although it's of incredibly important work to know how, to know and to address the situation or place from where one speaks, so if we know that position is never neutral, it's never omniscient, it's of equal importance to acknowledge and take on board that these points or locales exist in a milieu. They exist in a field, and it is in this context that constitutes its generic or connective neighborhood. It's in this way that we can diagnose a crucial, what I would call geometrical omission in any framework of thought that treats the points as if they can be adequately conceived outside that genericity, can be adequately generous, can be you can address particularities without addressing the global field, and as if one is obliged to think this problem as an either-or dilemma, pitting the particular against the global or vice versa. So I think these tendencies in thought can be found in both modern and postmodern eras that place emphasis on fragments, on parts, and on differences as an absolute, either on a disciplinary level or strictly on identitarian particularisms. The consequences of this geometric omission can be succinctly imagined by another example of the Earth, that one that's popularly used by Reza Negrestani, where my local or particular phenomenological perspective, it yields, of course, a flat Earth. We could call this the concrete or manifest image perspective. And where the global perspective yields something totally other, a sphere floating in space, in what we could call the abstract or scientific image perspective, again, a perspective which most of us here will only ever experience as an image. Now, neither modes of describing the same object, Earth, are sufficient, even if they're both correct from a certain perspective. We can only achieve a more accurate picture of reality and navigational know-how when we are able to synthesize the two. So what this call for synthesis entails is the recognition of the movement is the object or an identity that can be perceptible, and the field or the abstract, global, or connective space embedding said object. So abstractions in this light are not something to be overcome, but they serve as a kind of epistemic driver for a generative alienation that helps us get more thorough traction on reality and the sets of cognitive and behavioral affordances that are rendered possible because of this capacity for abstraction. So to paraphrase the philosopher Bois, with more than 7 billion of us on the planet, the mediation of the interpersonal by the abstract impersonal is both unavoidable and indispensable. For when we bind collectivity to community, we actually abstract a maximally expansive solidarity with other humans. So even the category of the we, I would add, requires a sort of high degree of abstraction so as to function beyond the phenomenological and insular limits, those constraints often enforced via immediate communitarian ideals. How are we doing with time, all right? Speed it up? Okay. Good. Until when did you want to stop the... Oh, like block the question. Okay. So complexity is a way to approach our geometrical omissions, posing deep challenges as to how to move between states and scales without one overriding the other, so as not to regress into the immobile isolation of particulars, or suggesting that the global must subsume critical differences inherent to those particularities in order to privilege a comprehensive scale.
No need to hurry. You were perfect.
All right. Given the urgency and magnitude of some of humanity's greatest challenges that are definitively not reducible to a localization or a point, a politics directed at the immediate here and now is not sufficient. We cannot substantially act towards a transformative state if, metaphorically speaking, we're only bound to a flat earth. Nor is it in any way desirable to nor of modernism. So it seems ever more pressing to develop tools allowing us to overcome this geometrical omission. Forging mobile concepts capable of thinking complex part to whole, point to field, identity to genericity relations, and more crucially, exploring the socio-political ramifications of such a movement of thought. Oops, we're here, yeah. But just before jumping into the political ramifications, I don't think we yet possess a coherent methodology for this transdisciplinary imperative required by complexity. So there's going to be all these steps we've got to do to get to this kind of cognitive space. So how can artificial general intelligence, or a kind of future when we'll have minds that aren't required on the dependence of a brain, how can this be bootstrapped into the process? Is it autonomous to some degree, or is it merely a human-centric cognitive extension, like the type suggested by Catherine Hales, where computation serves a specifically human use to access and simply parse more stuff? So despite the term transdisciplinarity having been a buzzword for years, if not decades, and something that isn't even particularly novel to prescribe as an epistemic necessity for complexity, we seem caught at a methodological impasse for the integration of knowledges, in the plural, that must also include modes of knowledge generation that have been ignored by Enlightenment scientific standards. So although she's rather scant on this methodological specificity that we're going to require, and more experimentation needs to be required, the developments in thought from the philosopher of science, Anne-Françoise Schmidt, to address our contemporary objects of concern, provides us with a kind of opening that seems fruitful to begin tackling what she calls integrative objects. So integrative objects are those things that we've been discussing, like the economy as a kind of object, meaning that they're extra-local, they exist in multiple sites simultaneously, they occupy multiple temporalities, so the secondary qualities of which we may be able to sense, but they equally include the long duration of geological transformation, or the microsecond of communications activity, which we cannot, of course. They can never be grasped in full, and one can only perhaps sense a residual trace of a larger macro process, just like you can't sense climate change. One cannot point to these objects as if they would be readily locatable within either a spatial grid or an existing disciplinary specification, which constitutes a crucial injunction they make to alienate precisely those classical modern disciplinary confines. So it's in this regard that integrative objects, they kind of dissuade critique, since you cannot point to it comprehensively as a thing to be deconstructed. Rather, on the other hand, they require construction. They require the construction of a disciplinary milieu to even view or grasp them. So a field condition is never given in advance, but must be engineered in order to properly and cognitively host these new objects that we desperately need to get a hold on. So important to note here is that these objects, the ones sort of constitutive of our complex reality requiring politicization, radically undermine both the tyranny of givenness as if there's a stable background upon which things sit ready and waiting for analysis or discovery. This echoes to some degree the mathematician Alexander Grothendieck, who had spoken to the tyranny of immediate perception and its consequences for the apprehension of space as something merely surrounding us, with, of course, its traditional articulation in Euclidean geometry. The construction of this hosting milieu is precisely what Schmidt identifies as the need for a generic epistemology, since it seeks to identify zones of inseparability between disciplines, and crucially, between the problems in these disciplines. Rather than advocating for a mere agglomerative approach where knowledge is treated as if purely mechanical, and of course far beyond the call so typical in transdisciplinary buzz, demanding mere sort of linguistic translatability between fields. This generic epistemology is the creation of interstitial fields of heterogeneity, kind of like cutouts from a Venn diagram, wherein affinities between overlapping fragments of knowledge territories take on new shape due to continuities between common problems, in a way generating new knowledges unattainable from any one field alone. So we know we no longer inhabit a mechanical world that is articulable through particular compartmentalized disciplines. Universe of a containable totality. We know that classical perspectivalism, presenting us with an illusionary sort of subjective horizon from a specified vantage lens point of view, is only at best an indication of the limitation of our phenomenological human-world interface. We know that time marches to a radically different tempo than the secondary finite time of an individual human, or the clock we devised and continually try to beat. So why do our socio-political and self-representational structures so often continue to adhere to our simplified, constrained, and immediate modes of reality projection? If the Copernican moment described earlier definitively removed us from the center, it was also a symptom for an even greater, even more general revolution that was mapped out by Hans Blumenberg, wherein any equation of visibility and reality was rendered obsolete, revealing the gap between our biological perceptual faculties and our access to the scale of the universe, both unfathomably large and infinitesimally small. So today, according to Carlo Rovelli, it is arguable that we're on the frontier of another Copernican moment in uprooting both our self-image and our world image. If we begin to synthesize and integrate some of the radically abstract, extra phenomenological developments in knowledge from the 20th century. So without fetishizing the often hugely counterintuitive and seductively fascinating domain of the hard science, like shout out to physics nerds, the consequential problems lies less in revealing how ignorant and limited we are, but in how these developments fundamentally alter the self-definition of humanness itself, and how those self-images can generate other cohabitational possibilities with each other and the world. The consequence of entering the Anthropocene indexes the double movement of a positive feedback loop, so that we are simultaneously quite a Promethean species, able to fundamentally alter the very fabric of the planet that sustains our existence, whether we do so ignorantly or not, yet equally utterly vulnerable as a result of our very own interventions. Ours is a moment of volatility and contingency that almost empirically refutes the dominant political narratives that continue to inform us there is no alternative. Just what those alternatives may be is, of course, the fundamental political question, but is a question that cannot be properly answered through sheer will, voluntarism, immediacy, simplified nor symbolic modes of address alone. We'll finish on an easy slide. Jacques Rancière asserts, and I wholly agree with him here, that politics cannot be relegated to merely parliamentary procedures of kind of steering the ship of familiar charted waters, but it is the articulation of the part with no part in the sensible order. So the effects of which are a redistribution of common sense, or as we can now suggest, a redistribution of knowing how. We need to augment this definition beyond the limits exclusively privileging speech acts and modes of appearing alone, and equally turn our sights on how to make the insensible or the complex a political force as well. If we are to manage to include these so-called integrative objects within a framework affording politicization, and not merely sequestered away in the disciplinary pursuits of intellectual expertise. Politics, as it were, in this sort of synthesized description, is equal to the redrawing of a map of intra and extra-human world relations that fundamentally intervenes in and disturbs the cognitive coordinate systems that have guided those relations. Such a move entails a ramping up of our abstractive capacities in order to better navigate and politically integrate a complexity and the demands for generic epistemology they necessarily entail. Today, a politics bound exclusively to an anthropocentric regime of phenomenological and intellectual chauvinism denies us access to the type of extra-local, non-particular objects and socio-environmental relations and requiring urgent politicization. So to remain strictly bound to a socio-environmental regime of immediate appearances and exclusively human intelligence would be the metaphorical equivalent of a politics operable only on a flat earth. And while that flatness does indeed exist from a particular perspective, it is insufficient until it is synthesized with and can transit to another scale of reality. So if we're to start to think towards a horizon of post-capital world-making, we can only do so by refashioning our self-understanding, instantiating demands that are both contemporaneous in time to our historical circumstance and commensurate with complex global reality that is always extra singular and unbound to our limited phenomenological constraints alone. So just to end on a very highly speculative note, responding to the need to politically integrate these complex objects, we must also synthesize, as we've been saying, non-human intelligence. So we may look to the user outlined by the design theorist Ben Bratton in his diagram of the stack to better grasp the expansion of epistemology's potential generators. So here the user could be a person, an AI bot, a sensor, or it could even be a molecule. Now, though, of course, we can't simply equate the production of data with knowledge, we also cannot know in advance what sorts of intelligence may emerge from the mutual entanglement of such entities in their future incarnations. For this, we require an interface, an augmentative coupling device designed for an affordance of what we may speculatively call a generic user epistemology. So that's it. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Patricia. We're going to do the same. We have the mics and you can ask the questions. We're going to take not as many as we did the first time, because there is a little less time for questions, but who wants to go first?
Thank you very much for this relevant talk. I think it makes a lot of sense. But there is one problem, and that is, do you need complex thinking mind in order to understand complex things? I mean, people might say this is intellectual bullshit, and I would not like that they do this. I think that it is translatable too. like I think that you can tell to people that not the Occupy Wall Street movement marginalized, and explain that Bernie Sanders cashed in enormously on all the work Occupy did. So you can point out relations. What's your point on this?
If I understand, because I think it's like almost two parts here. I agree with the fact that perhaps the way it's phrased in this theoretical language is not suitable for mass distribution. This is a very legitimate, because I think we actually really need to talk about what I love this word in French, vulgarisation. So I think this is an actual important point to also address the kind of libidinal aspect. So you're not going to seduce anyone into complexity, the relationship between complexity and politics by this, without that libidinal excitement and so on. The question of I think that's a really difficult question. If I understood correctly, can a non-complex, kind of non-augmented mind access complexity? I would say probably yes, but I wouldn't necessarily. I think what we'd have to start discussing is more like collective intelligence, right? Because I don't think anyone could hold the picture of some of these complex objects in their head, but certainly we may be able to share in the responsibility of holding pieces together and somehow develop ways to share this kind of knowledge. I mean, I think that's a general, like that none of us have to recreate the Copernican revolution to accept it as part of like human knowledge history, for example. So the sort of general relationship of cognitive achievements by humans as such, and how those become part of the shared human history. So that seems like a very convoluted answer to your to your question. But I wasn't quite sure how the Bernie Sanders things. Were you just were you referring more to like pointing out the genealogy of things, like how something like a figure like Bernie Sanders
Yes.
come to being?
The process side of any action that continues in other actions and rely on it.
Sure. You mean like
Bernie Sanders and his grassroots movement, which was so much based on attacking Wall Street, makes profit from the Occupy movement and the attacking of Wall Street, which was at that moment revolutionary and completely new and unimaginary for many people that this could happen.
Well, do you think when I hear you the way that you're putting a tone on profit, so it's almost like you sound like Bernie Sanders, took advantage of the work of these grassroots activists and is kind of appropriating in the negative way, but I think you could also see it. I don't know I'm not so well versed on the precise histories, but at the same time you could say, isn't that actually a win for Occupy? That
Yes. That's what I mean.
I mean, maybe it's unfortunate that the credits are not necessarily being made explicit, and that's just out of respect, kind of important. But it sounds like a kind of win if, just as if the way that Bernie Sanders performed so beyond anyone's expectations in the primaries, hopefully, brings Clinton's. It's doubtful, but hopefully influences, a little bit more.
I just want to point out that there are relations, and that saying that Occupy is marginalized, stop, over, didn't work, is a simplification.
Oh, absolutely,
So
and I would be the first to admit, as a North American, so as a Canadian, we absolutely could not use the word like class. This was just like not a word. Class was not a word. And one of the major achievements that Occupy did manage to bring is I can go home and talk to my mom about class. A non-intellectual, it's in her head now. They managed to disseminate in the popular sphere this idea of inequality. And that was just not part of the North American discourse. I realized that in Europe it was a little bit more discussed, but it was not something part of our media landscape. And that and to itself is a massive achievement, that it's put into the head that there's a structural inequality and this can be remedied. I think it's an achievement unto itself. Yeah.
Thank you. What is the post-Westphalian epistemic moment?
What does it mean? Well, we have like the West. I mean, it's a bit of a cheap metaphor, you could say. But if you're gonna have, if it's like national sovereignty, could be, you know, like the fact that we've come to some consensus about. We may not have consensus on what those borders are, but that we have consensus of the existence of nation states, ushered in through the Westphalian treaties. And if those are the ones guarding and protecting the borders, then the same sort of move. If we're going to kind of question the efficacy of that structure, because no one state can tackle the economy, the economic, like the situation of the global economy. No one state can tackle the climate change, for example. I mean, these are issues that don't really know boundaries. The same sort of thing, to my mind, needs to happen within the way knowledge is created as such, right? We can't just go from our bubbles of creation. They're only going to give us very limited. It's like if I'm only seeing a partial side of this, object that I so urgently need to understand to get traction on and so on. And if all of these disciplines are only yielding cross sections of it at best, then I think that this, move of like porous borders in knowledge would be sort of what I mean by the post-Westphalian knowledge moment, epistemic moment. It is a bit of a cheap metaphor, I'll admit.
I have thank you very much, Patricia. I have a brief question that is coming from the background of my conviction that, or my doubt that there is an actual increase of complexity in interactions in the social, political, earthly realm or realm of matter. And the question is there maybe a conflation of complexity as an object of epistemology, as an object of knowledge, thereby an item of consciousness and awareness brought by an enormous increase of scientific research into complexity and all that, bringing this phenomenon into our heads on a mass scale, on the one hand, and complexity as a fact of material, psychic, social interaction. Is there a conflation in your talk? That's my question, because I was not sure, and I think it's relevant in the relation of the question of Jan, which is how can we translate? Because said stupidly, if we are dealing here with a psychological phenomenon, not least, complexity as an issue of awareness, blinding, I think, many people, including myself, towards possible solutions, or being extremely disencouraging for tackling problems. So if this is the case, maybe the view or the question of how to translate this, I think, great approach into action would shift, the perspective on these problematics. I'm not sure if I'm clear. But.
Do you mean if I'm just trying to better understand the question? So I agree with you that it's not new that it's more complex. I mean, in a way, maybe though it's always been complex relative to I guess it's always a kind of question of relativity in some degree. At the same time, I think that there hasn't been really a history of in human history there hasn't been a moment where we've been so interconnected and maybe aware of it, because we do have some type of access to it. We, all of these things. So, and there is for sure the risk that because we even invented a science called complexity studies that didn't exist 500 years ago, that for sure we're like start to put in, you know, we start to like force the world to fit the science that we've identified to some degree. That's you know, I think a relatively, you know, that it's a semi-risk. At the same time, I think that there's a reason why a certain discourse emerges, because there is this increasing tendencies happening, and we need to have a discipline or a methodological approach in order to address it. But I wasn't. Was there another part?
No, I think that's a longer talk. We should have maybe another time. But I just, you know, I asked the question also in front of the background of observing that on the actual level of political activism, the new simplistic populist right-wing movements gain a lot of momentum, and you can look at this as a problem, but you can also look at it as a strategy that is successful in order to. So I wonder, could one, and it's connected to Jan's question in the sense that could one internalize this scheme, you know, allow also complex outcomes of this internalization in the sense that we come up with a discourse or a type of action that is not necessarily complex or does not follow the awareness of complexity, but maybe a set of simple convictions, values.
Well, I mean, that's the thing, is I think that, I think that I would kind of try to tie this into this know-how question, the stereoscopy thing. So, like, how do you change the human self-image? Because I would say, like, on the one hand, when you say that, yeah, it's these, like, we're having these, in Europe with the rise of the right, it's these very reductive, simplistic reactions to complex phenomena, etc., and they seem to be very successful in seducing people. If you really unpack that argument, the fact that people identify in any sort of nationalistic way, that's highly complex. And it's just become know-how, right? There's no real conscious reflection about, like, you're identifying with a bunch, like, millions of strangers about a particular territory, you know, like, that's really abstract. And we even, it's so kind of common sense that we can even say, oh, but it's such a simplified thing to kind of do this nationalistic thing. But to even have the fact of nationalism, of like millions of strangers identifying under one national, it's like, that's a crazy amount of history and identification that had to go into that. So, you know, I think it's, what may seem simple, if you unpack it, could get actually more elaborate. And then second of all, you know, how would we start changing that self-image so that it wouldn't be bound? How would that know-how wouldn't be bound to that, you know, negative nationalism that we see happening now, which is, of course, not going to be instantaneous. These are, like, again, very slow, crazy amount of history and identification that had to go into that. So, you know, I think it's, what may seem simple, if you unpack it, could get actually more elaborate. And then second of all, you know, how would we start changing that self-image so that it wouldn't be bound? How would that know-how wouldn't be bound to that, you know, negative nationalism that we see happening now, which is, of course, not going to be instantaneous. These are, like, again, very slow processes to change the way humans understand themselves in the world.
Okay, we have time for one more. Is there anybody? Otherwise, okay.
Thank you, Patricia. That was a very good talk, very interesting. Just to follow up on the point that the last two members of the audience were making about this question around complexity reduction. You made a point about nationalism, that nationalism is a simple idea that indexes a complex or a relationship between an individual and a complex whole, a nation state, and its various, you know, economic, ethno-nationalist components, etc. So it's a question about, I guess it's a question around what are the right forms of complexity reduction? So what are the right filters, or if you're thinking about it kind of politically, I mean, another very significant form of complexity reduction, which was completely false, was the whole idea that you know, one of the central ideological justifications for austerity, which was the nation-state's finances, which was austerity, which members of the audience, they'll accept that. That sounds like that makes some kind of sense. They'll accept that. Maybe they can, borrow at incredibly good rates. They can use that to reinvest, etc. So is it not so much? I mean, so you were kind of saying that what we need to do is to come up with this kind of ways in which we can kind of either through revising our epistemological frameworks or by literally kind of boosting our intelligence through various kind of technical appendages that we can change our way of visioning complexity. But also we need better and maybe more democratic ways of coming up with workable complexity reduction tools that will say that this is the ones that shave down this complexity in a way that might be a better. I mean, it's a question of representation, I guess, at the same time, right? So there's a kind of how well does this stuff, do these particular simplifications represent this complex whole?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, I wasn't talking so much about the reduction of complexity, but I think you're right. And also, if we tie it into the other questions about like how to disseminate this and make it, politic this and make the example you gave about Germany and seeing the bids. The example you gave Germany.
So there's a
the step of, okay, on one hand, I guess I was focused more on in this talk of augmenting cognitive capacities, and you're speaking about, okay, but then how do we still make that tractable and in a way that we can disseminate? I mean, that's an interesting thing because that's also a design question too. And that's hugely interesting for me working also in design, particularly with interest in economic literacy and how to make these issues somehow, comprehensible in a glance. I mean, I guess this would require a load of experimentation. I mean, I'd be definitely, I agree that this step needs to happen if it's going to become popularized in the positive sense of the world. Positive sense. As any design challenge, it would be like case by case. And obviously you don't reduce it. I mean, I think the reductions you were speaking of are like, they're instrumentalizing the reduction because they're just using it to like justify certain policies. So it's not even an accurate or truthful reduction. There's ways you can reduce, not even it's minimal amount of information you'd need in order to like get the general thrust. Like when my Prime Minister describes quantum computing so famously on YouTube clips, but it's still, it's like fairly accurate, even if it's a reduction. So, yeah. So.
Well deserved. We're going to have a short break again. We need it also for a bit of a technical change, so another 10 minutes, the same procedure, and then we are welcome to come back in for Helen Hester's lecture. Thank you.